The good news is I think that the most likely scenario is that China will continue to grow well for at least another 15 years. I like to call myself a cautious optimist because I think there's a good chance this optimistic scenario will play out. But I'm cautious because I basically agree with Min-Shin about the diagnostic of the problem. So I think the fundamentals are in place for China to continue to grow well. You know, it has this large rural-urban migration that's creating a large urban labor force. It's a very open economy that's well connected to the global market. And many Chinese cities have created a good investment climate where Chinese entrepreneurship is generating a lot of private investment in innovation and development. All those fundamentals remain in place for about 15 years. But I agree with Min-Shin that there are some very serious risks. I see the three biggest risks to be the environment, the social deficit, and also the trade imbalance. The reason I can be a cautious optimist is that I think that the government is moving in each of these three areas. So let me just say a few words about each area, starting with environment. I really do think natural resource scarcity and environmental degradation is the single biggest challenge that China faces. It's a natural resource scarce country. The whole country has a pretty serious water shortage, and the northern half of the country has a really acute water shortage, and almost half the people live in the northern half of the country. So you've got water shortage, you've got serious pollution of water all around China. You also have serious air pollution. China has 20 of the 30 most air polluted cities in the world, and we've just worked together with the environmental agency in China to do the first careful estimate of the health costs of air and water pollution in China, and the health costs are really quite alarming. So I think the environmental issues are serious. You read about them all the time in the New York Times and other Western outlets. What you may not be aware of is that in most environmental areas, there is progress in China. So air pollution has improved in a majority of Chinese cities. Particularly in the southern part of the country, there's been pretty dramatic declines in air pollution. Water pollution. In the southern part of the country, in the early 1990s, almost no river system had drinkable water, and now more than 60% of the rivers in the south have drinkable water. So there have been clear measures that have been taken to try to improve and address some of these environmental issues. So I'm somewhat optimistic that that trend will continue. I would say I think a key part of that is pricing natural resources appropriately. China has tended to have low energy and water prices, and they have been gradually raising the price of water and the price of energy, and that's one factor that's led to conservation and to better use. But I'd like to paint a balanced picture of a pretty serious environmental crisis, but progress in some parts of the country. It's interesting that it's in some parts of the country. I think Chinese cities compete with each other. They used to compete just to attract investment. They used to want to attract the big polluting industries. Now I see a lot of Chinese cities competing to try to create a greener environment because they realize that a good living environment is part of being competitive. So you've got cities like Hangzhou and Suzhou that are working very hard to create a better living environment because they want to attract engineers and top flight talent to compete with Silicon Valley. Second key issue for China is the social deficit. China has developed a very high degree of inequality, similar to the level of inequality in the United States. But the way to think about this is that urban incomes in China are going up at 10 to 12% per year. Rural real incomes are going up at 5 to 6% per year. So that generates a lot of inequality, but I emphasize that rural real incomes are going up much more rapidly than anywhere else in the world, so there continues to be very rapid poverty reduction. Just between 2001 and 2004, China cut its poverty by 1/3 in 3 years. So it is true that this rapid growth is benefiting everyone in the country materially. It's just benefiting the people in the cities much more so than people in the countryside. In China, the income inequality is a particularly serious issue because the country has a very decentralized fiscal system where local governments generally have to pay for health and education. So where you have poor rural communities, they're supposed to pay to educate their own children and provide health, and they're at a very serious disadvantage. So China is at risk of having this inequality perpetuate itself because the poorer areas cannot provide good social services. So I think that is a very serious issue for the country. There's a lot of social unrest around some of the inequality issues. Again, though, I do see some areas of progress. In the most recent budget, the government made a very significant increase in the amount of money going to rural education and rural health, and I think that the budget is taking quite seriously the issue of putting more money into rural health, rural education, rural development more generally. I guess an economist would say the obvious solution to the inequality problem is to speed up the migration of people from the countryside to the cities. For a long time, the Chinese government resisted migration, restricted it through a registration system. That registration system is slowly breaking down. The best hope for dealing with the inequality is to make it easy for people to leave the countryside and move to cities, and we're beginning to see some evidence of that. Now, the third issue I mentioned briefly is the trade imbalance. I actually think the trade deficit from the US side is not a particularly big issue, not that important, and happy to discuss that. But I think from the Chinese side, the trade imbalance really is a problem. China's trade surplus has reached 10% of GDP. Quite a bit of China's growth comes from increasing the trade surplus every year. Now that China is a big player in the world market, there just are not going to be markets, even without political interference, but protectionism, they're just not going to be markets that can absorb a big increase year after year. China is still a developing country, so the 10% trade surplus, 10% of GDP trade surplus, means that China is exporting capital of 10% of GDP every year, which frankly just doesn't make sense for a poor country. I like to joke that every Chinese peasant implicitly owns $1,000 of US Treasury bonds. So the nice low return instrument that you can be sure you'll get a capital loss on that. You may not have a tractor, you may not be able to send your kids to school, but the government is holding $1,000 of Treasury bonds on your behalf. It just simply doesn't make economic sense. So I think addressing the trade imbalance is an important short-run challenge for China. Now, I want to end by saying there's a very obvious policy package to address all three of these challenges simultaneously. If the government would more aggressively raise the price of energy and water and enforce environmental standards, they can address the environmental issues more forcefully. That by itself would tend to make Chinese people poorer. If all of a sudden the price of gasoline doubles or the price of water doubles, that would tend to make Chinese people poor. But if you let the exchange rate appreciate 10% or so, that by itself tends to make Chinese people richer, and also that by itself tends to be deflationary and would mitigate the effect of raising the price of energy and water. And then that would, of course, slow down the export machine, which is something the government's concerned about. But ironically, if you ask the government now, why don't you spend a lot more on health and education? They've made some increases, but if you say, why don't you spend dramatically more on health and education, they'll say, we're worried about overheating of the economy. So if you allowed some exchange rate appreciation to cool off the manufacturing sector, you could actually pump a lot of public money into health and education, which would meet real needs and stimulate the macroeconomy. So there's an obvious policy package that would keep China growing at a very healthy rate, but address the environmental and social deficits much more forcefully than is occurring. And then the obvious question to ask is, why aren't they doing it? And there I would say that the senior leadership is gradually doing this. So you do see increases in energy and water prices. We've seen a little bit of appreciation of the exchange rate. We've seen a 20% increase in the government spending on rural health and education. And from my point of view, I would like to see more rapid movement on this policy package. But I do see movement on the policy package. And if China continues down that path, I think they can grow successfully in a more balanced way, meet their needs, take some of the pressure off the international imbalances, and DHL can make a lot of money by investing successfully in China. So that's the optimistic scenario.